We didn't record last week because we wanted it to be a relaxed discussion since it was an open forum, but we did want to record tonight because a number of people have also asked. Okay, Rachel is a biocultural anthropologist with an emphasis on African-American biohistory and social history, bioanthropological research practices, and histories of US American biological anthropology. Initially trained in skeletal biology, her work focused on looking at the relationships between health, disease, and social location in people whose remains are in the W. Montague Cobb Anatomical Collection and interred at the New York African Burial Ground. This research led to a broader interest in how African-American skeletal remains and living populations were centered in the development of research practices and racial formation in US biological anthropology.
Yeah, shut up.
Current projects continue to draw on intellectual and political work tied to Cobb and his laboratory from 1932 to the present as sites for understanding science as a social practice through a Black feminist lens. Now I will introduce Asia Lands, who is a doctoral candidate and Ford Dissertation Fellow at Syracuse University, where she studies historical archaeology and cultural heritage preservation. She holds a BS in anthropology from Binghamton University and an MA in anthropology from NYU. Her dissertation, Female Negro, Embodied Experiences of Inequality in Historic New York City, is a study of the skeletal and archival remains of Black women who died in the turn of the century in New York City. In intersectional approaches, she aims to better understand how race, gender, class, and place come to be literally embodied and reinsert physical remains into the wider discussion of Black women's histories in the United States while interrogating the ethics of housing human remains in museums. And finally, Delande Justinvil is a doctoral student in anthropology and 2021-22 Peter S. Buck Predoctoral Fellow at the National Museum of Natural History and National Museum of African American History and Culture. His interests lie at the intersection of biocultural anthropology, cultural history, race and science, and Black study. His research mobilizes an anthropology of Black remains that brings together biological, archaeological, and archival methods to interrogate embodiments of violence in as the afterlives of slavery, with a particular focus on the 19th and 20th century Mid-Atlantic. Delande has participated in excavations in the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and the US, as well as curatorial and collections-based initiatives concerning repatriation and racial equity in university museums. His dissertation project applies critical race theory and theories of violence to bioarchaeological analysis to investigate African-American skeletal remains from recently discovered burials in the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, DC. So I'm going to turn it over to Rachel now, who is going to organize the conversation, and I'll probably pop back up at some point. And we'll also monitor the chat, as I said, for questions. Okay, Rachel.
Hello, everyone. Thank you and welcome. We're looking forward to this discussion. I'm particularly excited about it because it is featuring a couple of people who are already important to the discipline and who will certainly play an important role in leading the next phase of bioanthropology, Delande Justinvil and Asia Land. So I want to start out by having them share how it is that they're entering into this discussion. And I think we're going to have Delande go first to speak a bit more about his background and what he's bringing to the table in terms of helping us make sense of what's going on right now. Delande?
Thank you so much, Devin and Rachel, for those introductions. A lot of kindness. I don't know if I deserve all that, but I'll try my best. Over the past a few months, I've really been dismayed, to say the least, over what seems to be constant and consistent announcements over these revelations. So before I So to prevent myself from stuttering and stumbling through my thoughts like I'm about to do, I wrote out something in advance. So I'll just read that. Princeton University, April 2021. University of Pennsylvania, February 2021. Harvard University, January 2021. Georgetown University, 2018. University of Georgia, November 2015. University of Virginia, October 2012. There are others, the list goes on. In light of what seems to be endless announcements concerning the revelations of remains of Black individuals, both free and enslaved, on university campuses, to say that I've been upset is an understatement. Anger, an understatement. Frustration, an understatement. Compounding crises that seem to mark the legacies of what it means to be Black in this practice. Confronting the violence of lives once lived while learning of the continued violations that persist into death. The painful dejection of studying death and dying amid this year of death and dying. The overwhelm of studying bodies disembodied in this body that I embody. Of the utmost concern, what I seem to be the most preoccupied by is what comes next. How do we move forward? How might we do right? Amid calls for return, response, redress, and retrospection, there seems to be an alignment of repatriation and reparations, which brings some questions to mind. First, what do we lose when we allied the bones of our beloved with the debt of our 40 acres and a mule? Does a framework of reparations commit us to a reinternment into the very racial capitalist system that expired many of the lives of those whose remains make up these very institutional collections? Does this then commit us to constructs of biocentric colonial logics that reinforce nationalist fictions and geographies of domination? Is there a way to shift our reparative ideologies from practices of reparations to maybe praxis of repair, where we think anti-colonially and relationally about our responsibilities to each other and this what comes next? Is there a way to defend the dead that mobilizes a forensic care? While the issues at hand are pressing and urgent, I hope that we take the time and consideration to do what is right for those who came before us and those who will come after, so as not to resign our efforts to a second death, but contour the conditions for life otherwise.
Asia.
Hey everyone. So I didn't write anything out, and I've been thinking about this. Just before coming here, I decided to watch a documentary called 40 Years a Prisoner on the folks associated with MOVE. And while watching it, I was just angry. There's no other way to put it. I was outraged. And what really broke my heart was witnessing Michael Africa Jr. talking about, learning his parents were in prison. And, this long struggle to get him out of prison for the supposed murder of a cop who was likely killed by friendly fire. And all I could think was, wow, I'm thankful that my father wasn't in prison when I was a child, because he had served time in prison. My father couldn't vote. And apparently as young, I just went in and out of prison for various supposed petty offenses that were really just our racist local cops in our small town harassing him, specifically because he was married to a white woman and they did not like that. And so while I'm looking at all this and considering police violence, I constantly think of my father and my childhood. And my father died when I was only 6 years old. Working job he was overqualified for. Because of that criminal record, even though he earned his degree from Binghamton University, the same university I would go on to attend, he could not get a decent job and he died working construction. So when I see these sorts of things, it's actually something that as Black people in the United States, we live. And so when I see, all of these Black people being murdered by cops, when I see someone showing the remains of a Black child killed by police violence, I see my loved ones, I see my nephews, I see my brothers, my cousins, I see my father. And so when I came to anthropology, as soon as I learned the history of the field, I sort of wondered, where do I fit in here? And that's what led me to start studying the history of race in anthropology. I started during my master's, and now I carry on during my PhD. And one of a huge focus of my research is how do I rationalize being someone who was trained as a physical anthropologist, bioarchaeologist, and yet I'm interacting with the remains of Black people who are kept in repositories in museums. And there seems to be no end in sight to the remains being kept in these places. And so I often wonder, what are the effects of my research, and is my research equal if I'm trying to highlight this history? And so I come to this conversation hoping that we can think about ways to do right by the remains of Black people who, we identify with as a sort of descendant community in this country, and not just, recent events such as, the skulls of enslaved people found at Harvard, these folks that were killed in the bombing of the MOVE bombing. There are far more bodies in museums and universities than that. And I think it's time that as a field, we seriously reconsider what we are doing. Thank you.
All right, I can hear. Thank you so much, Asia. Your comments in particular, and certainly Delande's as well, talk about a very different type of restoration of personhood than what is typical, or what is kind of organic, if you will, to forensic anthropology. And so I would love to hear you all say a bit more about that kind of disconnect that has a lot to do with the understanding of embodiment in terms of personal experience and otherwise. And also, Asia, I know that you in particular, and I believe Delande also, has experience in forensic anthropology. And so you're also aware of some of the ethical guidelines that are in place, and you have witnessed best practices that also kind of give you a great platform for speaking to this disconnect around restoring personhood. I don't know who wants to go first.
I can start chatting a little bit about, I remember your second part about forensics. Embodiment came first. Which I'll do embodiment first. I'll just be real quick. So embodiment, I suggest everyone, so the theory I use when talking about embodiment actually comes from a medical anthropologist, Dr. Clarence Gravely, and his concept of race becomes biology. And he makes this very strong argument drawing on some literature out of public health by Nancy Krieger, that how you are treated based on your race influences your body, your biology. And now, as we are learning with epigenetics, this is where we get this notion of like transgenerational trauma. And so the problem is, as anthropologists, we now know that race is not actually coded for in our genes, not actually biological. And so we constantly say it's a social construct. However, what that does, if we don't qualify that with what happens based on your perceived race in society, is that we just keep this negative circle going where people are like, well, if race isn't real, then it can't be, that Black people are treated unfairly in this country. Or you get the opposite, that when we see really difficult, we see health problems, for example, higher blood pressure in Black communities, they're like, oh, then race must be real. It's tied to being Black, rather than looking at how violence and racism predispose us to these very negative health outcomes. And so that's how I theorize embodiment in my research. I don't know, Delande, if you wanted to add to that.
Yes, of course. I don't theorize embodiment. I think I approach, well, I don't think, I try my best to approach questions of embodiment through a more like a Fanonian framework, and thinking about how these different aspects of culture and society that quite literally like similar to Gravely's work, how race becomes biology, but this kind of like a biopsychosocial framework, as like the medical field says, where you can literally trace, you can delineate the connections between how the social sphere um, and how it's affecting our psyches, which is also affecting our bodies. When I'm tending to these remains as carefully and as caringly as I can, I'm looking at these different, what we say in the field, non-specific indicators of health, these different elements on the remains that point out to the indicate a sort of a trauma or sort of an enactment of violence. And as opposed to seeing that as like a separate form of study from the theoretical or the conceptual, when I'm looking at these instances, I'm seeing directly what those social and psychological implications that must have happened alongside these biological ones. So in these different instances where I've had experiences with forensic anthropologists or forensic studies more broadly, it's it, I have a serious concern over the lack of lack of clarity and transparency over how these bodies, how these remains get to spaces so that they can be tended to. Um, because depending on the change of hands or the change of oversight, it brings me pause to think about what we lose, what we can't find out, or who is not giving them the right round of attention to think about these clear connections along these aspects of violence.
Thanks so much for that. And I would like to have you circle back to speaking more directly for folks in the audience who are not as familiar with all of this stuff as we are, about the difference between forensic understandings of personhood and your own understandings of personhood. So you've talked about the theoretical frameworks that you draw upon, and now kind of, if you could talk about and kind of distill that to speak more directly to the meaning. And at this point, if you would like to begin the process of talking about the specific human remains that you study as part of that, that would be helpful also, because we need to, again, for the folks who are not familiar, give them a little bit of historical background to how it is that so many people's bodies, and in many cases, Black bodies, have ended up in museums. But first, the personhood, and about the distinction between forensic understandings of personhood and your own. And if it doesn't fit into your response, then we will move to talking more specifically about the histories of collections. And I think, Asia, you were getting started.
Oh yeah, I can talk about the difference between forensic and historic contexts. So forensic anthropology, typically we think of it as being human remains that were they're 50 years or less in age. And so typically they're things that could go to court. Forensic just has to do with like potential legal action. And so usually things that are older than about 50 years, we consider to be historic. So I've worked with in both forensics and in historic collections. Now I've switched fully to historical archaeology. But in my undergrad, I worked with Dr. Donnie Stedman, who's an amazing forensic anthropologist. And at that time, I didn't work on any forensic cases as an undergrad, but Dr. Stedman was sort of the local consultant for the Binghamton area. And so most places don't have a full-time forensic anthropologist on staff. What they do is, if there's a case that, at least in New York, this is how the law goes, you have, a pathologist examining the body, and the pathologist would call Dr. Stedman if there were skeletal remains involved. And it was typically her, and sometimes her advanced graduate students would analyze that. During my master's, I worked briefly for the medical examiner, but that was on the a project related to September 11th. But when I took a course there, I actually don't recall. They had casts that had been made of certain cases sometimes, that I'm fairly certain they got consent from the families to make, but there weren't actually any remains there. And then most recently, I spent some time at the Smithsonian, and the only forensic case that we had there, I was working with. Oh, I actually saw Katie in the audience. So hey, Katie. The only remains I saw there were remains that they were specifically donated. So it was a case that they had consulted on, and the family wanted them to keep the remains to use for teaching purposes.
All right. Thinking along those lines, while I have not worked with forensic in a forensic anthropology lab per se, but my research in Georgetown, my engagement with forensics are the ways that, or the chain of command before the historic specialists get called in. So in this block of Georgetown, each of these homes, multi-million dollars, casual wealth. There, over the past like 20 or so years, there's been, well, longer than that, but within the context that I'm studying, a couple of decades, every time one of these homes wants to renovate or do some construction into their basement, go below ground level, what happens is that they each time, without fail, come upon a set of remains, the entire block. And what happens in that instance is the police get called out. The police then have to identify, or the police then have to come to the conclusion that it's not a homicide or some other form of incriminating instance, for which they then call out the officer, the office of the chief medical examiner, which hopefully there is a forensic anthropologist on staff, but as Asia said, there doesn't have to be at all times, just a pathologist or the examiner. And after they conclusively, rule out these these options, then the historic preservation specialist, the district archaeologist Ruth Tripoli, then gets called in, and she, develops a protocol of best practices of how to best excavate and excavate these remains, not to bring them to lab as specimens, but this is like salvage archaeology. This is rescue archaeology. If we don't excavate them because of property laws, they will be destroyed. So just want to clarify on that. What I was getting towards earlier was that there's so many steps between how quickly we can get them out of this space, how quickly we can tend to them. And while I completely understand and respect, and it's incredibly important for forensic identifications of personhood to offer these demographic identifications to sex, age, gender, as much as you can, they're just there's so many more holistic ways that we need to be considering these past peoples. These were living human beings, and in these cases, these were living human beings put under an inordinate amount of duress. And when you limit it to just the forensic identification, you lose these other aspects, and that's just the beginning point of how some of these violations and erasures begin in life and continue into death.
And inequitable distributions of power are really organic to forensic science, from the limitations around identification in a forensic context to, as Asia pointed out, the fact that you do not typically have full-time forensic scientists. And that's because there's not necessarily enough work to have a large pool of full-time practitioners. And so as a result, historically, you can imagine who the forensic scientists were, the people who had the privilege and the means to be able to have work that allows them to dabble and do this stuff on call as needed. And as I mentioned before, that extends all the way back to how these collections came to be in the first place. Asia, your dissertation research is focused on the Huntington Collection, which is one of the documented skeletal collections at the National Museum of Natural History. Would you mind giving a bit of background on the Huntington Collection? And if you want to speak to the other collections as well in some way too, but.
Yeah, so the Huntington Collection actually is kind of a textbook example of unidentified skeletal collection. So what happens throughout starting kind of around the mid 1800s and on, people, mainly white men, who are doctors and eventually physical anthropologists, are very interested in studying and defining who is a normal human, and organizing people by race and putting us in a hierarchy. And in order to do this, not only were they interested in living fleshed people, they were very interested in skeletons and especially skulls. And so we often start with like Sam Morton and the cranial collection, and then we go on from there. So the Huntington Collection consists of the remains in New York City from roughly 1890 to 1920. And they were dissected at the College of Physicians and Surgeons, which is part of Columbia University. And so at the time, they would be dissected by medical students. And it was essential for them to dissect bodies in order to learn about, the bodily exterior. The medical field is rapidly professionalizing during this time. They're trying to get rid of, if you've heard of like quacks and like, snake oil peddlers. And they're trying to make the field into more of a science. So Dr. George Sumner Huntington requires dissection by all of his students. And during this time period, bodies for dissection come from the unclaimed dead in the city. To go unclaimed, you're likely poor, impoverished. There's a lot of recent immigrants, people without family to claim their remains, or your family can't pay to bury you. And what's very interesting I found is that all of these, the folks that I research, when I pull their death certificates, it always says place of burial is city cemetery. And so I believe a lot of their loved ones or relatives, if you did say like, yes, you can dispose of the body for us, did not know what was going to happen. And so these bodies were dissected at Columbia. And Dr. Huntington wanted to amass a large comparative skeletal collection, but he was interested in just general human variation. Then came along L.S. Herlichka, the founder of physical anthropology and a racist, and he could not get over all of the dead bodies that Huntington had collected. I mean, he has people from all over the world, all sorts of different races, people with all sorts of different diseases and abnormalities and pathological conditions. And so over the years, Herlichka would eventually go to what has now become the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. And he and Huntington would trade. So Huntington would sometimes send him bones and Herlichka would send him different specimens, and they exchanged human body parts. Eventually, Huntington, his health starts to fail. The collection is too much for the College of Physicians and Surgeons. So in the 1920s, the entire thing gets sent to Washington, D.C. However, because it had originally been organized by bone or element, as we say, it couldn't get it all back together. Some of the catalog records are missing. And so now the collection, which originally, according to Columbia University Archives, may have had as many as 8,000 people. The collection database has about 3,600 listed, but according to Kristen Perlstein's research, it looks like there's only about 3,170 partial skeletons. Of those, about 30% are commingled. And it's identified because we know these people's, age, cause of death, sex, that sort of thing. And so you would go to these sorts of collections, especially if you study forensic anthropology, to try to come up with new ways to identify remains. Okay, so you might go there, and because these people had stature recorded at death, you could work on a formula to estimate, living stature from the bones, that sort of thing. Because the Huntington Collection is in such disarray from its history, it hasn't been used very much for those sorts of things. But more commonly, if you go to the Smithsonian, you'll end up using like the Terry collection or something that's it's in better shape, if you will, but came from the same, it came from unclaimed bodies from St. Louis. And so now a lot of what we're discussing when it comes to these identified collections, especially these older ones, is, is it ethical to have these people who never consented for their bodies to be kept in museums? And I'd like to add to this, arguably, they're not useful. And I'm saying like useful as in coming up with new forensic methodology on them, because people have changed a lot in the past, 100 plus or so years. And so if you're coming up with comparisons for, say, living populations, using poor people who died in turn of the century New York City, they're completely different from anyone who's alive now. And I can attest to that, having seen their remains. I mean, the things these people lived through and lived with before they died are horrifying. And so we now have to consider, what should we be doing with these identified skeletal collections?
Right, and not to mention the fact that the way in which they were organized in terms of forensic identification is highly racialized. So they weren't necessarily categorized in a way that reflects the, truth, if you will, of human biological variation, even back then. Delande, how do you want to respond to what Asia said?
Asia, I'm so happy you brought this up at the beginning of what you just said, that these initiatives, they weren't done, they were aimed at defining and categorizing humanity. And you had mentioned that they're interested in these remains, but they're also they were interested in living peoples. I think it's really important when we're talking about why do so many people end up in museums, to really like set this within like this history of like just how broad these practices really were. The origins of the ethnographic and museum, the colonial museum. That yes, there are these collections, but they also they display living human beings from different parts of the world in cages, on stages, behind bars, behind these different like as display specimen while still living. And I think it's really it's a point that I like to think about. I try my best to focus on is what these kind of like I don't know how to phrase this, like kind of like logics of captivity, if you will, that really undergird this entire institution. You have museums that are literally incarcerating living people while collecting their remains, and you can see how this is very specifically attached to at Harvard University. There are the daguerreotypes, which is literally a capture of enslaved bodies against their will, which are now being held captive against the family's will in that archive. And these same logics undergird all these forms of cataloging, collection, and falsification, which again are defined by like, how much they can capture and how they can hold them captive, which you can also extend to during the same times that they're burgeoning. You see asylums, you see different forms of carcerality also coming up. All of these museums, archives, asylums, prisons, they all there's this undercurrent of captivity that like define them all, and the ways that we can dictate variations of humanity through our ability to classify, catalog, and etc. So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Yeah, and actually, so I actually am really happy you brought up this discussion of inmates, people who were inmates of various institutions. So in the Huntington Collection, the majority of the 79 Black women I'm studying in this collection died in some sort of public institution, be it on Blackwell Island, which was here in New York City, and where all the poorhouses, almshouses, prisons, those sorts of things were located. And I already had known one woman died in prison for what had to have been a petty offense, because she was sent to Blackwell Island, to this, this place for minor infractions. But I actually just today, while doing research, found a record for one of the women I'm studying who was sentenced to 5 years in prison at Auburn Penitentiary, New York, Supposedly for third-degree burglary, she was let out early, but only because she had a very bad case of tuberculosis. She was released to the public hospital on Blackwell Island, and she died there a month after her release. Further, I have one woman in the study whose remains are missing, and her job was a museum freak, it says on her death certificate. And I've always been intrigued by her. Her name's Joanna. I wonder if her remains are gone because they were abnormal, as though, you know, she had something that, some sort of spectacle that made her into a freak. But at the same time, in her case, it's interesting because she was making a living off of whatever it was that made her a freak. But then, of course, upon death, she is taken, and who knows what happened to her remains.
You all are emphasizing, I mean, and you all are a part of a growing network of scholars who are doing such important work around the personhood of these people who are in these collections and the ways in which their personhood has been so incredibly limited. And so going again back to some of the history to provide some context, there are a couple of questions, or one question in particular about Fordisk, because for all of the experiences that are represented in these collections, like Joanna, like the people who Delande is working with and attempting to honor, who were buried in Georgetown, these folks were very much so reduced to specimens and measurements that have been used to kind of reinscribe these highly racialized categories in a juridical context. So would you all please speak to, I'm looking for the question, yes, how do you come up against Fordisk and that limited system, if you do work with that?
So I haven't worked for Fordisk in years.
Right.
Can
There's Fordisk 2.0, 3.0, right?
Yeah.
Version of them.
However, I do remember specifically when working with Fordisk, being taught the limitations of Fordisk by, you know, forensic anthropologists whom I was working with. So if for those of you who don't know what Fordisk is, it's this database where you input cranial measurements mainly of known people. And oh gosh, I don't even know how to start because it's just so problematic even right off the bat. So you're putting in, you know, the cranial measurements of known people. Mind you, these are the same exact cranial measurements that were taken all throughout the 1800s. I hope you recently saw Dr. Liz DeGangi and Jonathan Bethard. I'm trying to remember his last name. Their piece that recently came out. I highly encourage you to look it up. It's open access. It's amazing. So they're using these same measurements that were literally used to create race in the first place. So if you're not familiar with identifying race, or we'll say ancestry as a euphemism now, typically you're going to be looking at like the shape of the eye orbits, how far apart your eyes are, how wide your nose was, all these sorts of things on, you know, the deflesh on the skull. And so we have like known people who were identified, and we have historical collections of known people, or they even have some archaeological collections in there, I believe, in Fordisk in the database. And you put in all these measurements. So if you have an unknown individual, you then enter the same measurements, and it will tell you who they are closest to after some fancy statistics. So the problem is that no matter what you put in there, Fordisk is going to give you an answer. It's based off those stats. It's going to tell you who that individual is most similar to based on these measurements and statistics. And so if the population or group from which this person came from is not in there, they're going to put it with the next best thing. And this has for a long time been a problem. I remember learning about cases at the OCME where it was like, you know, because police and investigators want to know race because it's so ingrained in our society. And when, you know, the forensic anthropologist did the measurements, it was like, this person is likely of Indian descent as an Asian. It was completely wrong. And so also as people, you know, what I've realized that I find really fascinating just because it's been so drilled into my brain. You know, when I'm working with remains that are extremely old, and perhaps I have folks who came directly from Africa compared to folks who came directly from Europe. Oftentimes it's like I still can't help myself looking and be like, oh, that was one of the people from Africa. That person's from Europe. But, you know, looking at these general traits, that's not always right, though. We still find people that it's like, oh, they look so white. And then, you know, someone does DNA, which is a whole other problem. It's like they're 100% African. We can talk about that if you want to. So the problem is, if race doesn't exist, then what are the measurements we're putting in, and what is Fortis actually telling you? And I always wonder about it as someone who is mixed race, as you will, identify as a Black woman who happens to have a white mother. I mean, is Fortis going to be like, oh yes, look at this, you know, product of miscegenation? I don't know. And so it's really problematic. But fortunately for me, I haven't worked with Fortis in a while. So I don't know if anyone else has something to add.
Well, we're certainly going to open it up in a few minutes, but I did want to ask you all before we open up to kind of address the big question, which is, does biological anthropology and everybody else who's associated with it, do we need to get out of the body business? I mean, you all have kind of laid out very nicely that even though there are particular ways to restore personhood outside of a juridical context, there are still those limitations. You know, the people's stories don't get told. Asia, you've highlighted in particular the array of ethical guidelines that are in place and the fact that there are lots of people who follow them, but then you have situations like the one where the children who were killed in the bombing of the Move community end up in, certain folks' hands. So is there a way for us to continue studying human remains, but to do so in a way that is actually honoring these folks? And I'm asking that because that's a question that we need to address. And then there are also folks who have asked more specific questions related to that. And I see here, one is the state in which I work apparently continues to have a public charge law in which individuals who die under the care of the state are legally permitted to be submitted to state institutions and hospitals for study. So there's a disconnect between the legality and the ethicality of these bodies. And so they'd like your thoughts on this. And then earlier on during the discussion, there was a question: if the institutional reason for being is to maintain Western hegemony and to catalog the other who's been dominated, how could the institution honor the remains or culture of the other and study them at the same time? So what are your thoughts on that?
Personally, I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think it would be much better if museums got rid of a lot of their historical remains and repatriated them to the best of their ability, did something else with them. Because I guess the closest I can come to it is, you know, the women I'm looking at, for a lot of them, it has the religion listed on their death certificate. And, you know, most of them are Catholic or Protestant. And it's funny, like, so my grandmother's Catholic, and she is so opposed to anything happening to her body after death. And so I can't imagine that these women would want their remains in the conditioner right now. I feel that we should keep training people to work with bones and skeletons, because I mean, we're still going to have the need for bioarchaeologists whenever, you know, something comes up and we have to, you know, get bodies out the ground that are at risk. But again, that should be done with the descendant community, hopefully. And I support the use of donated collections. I mean, they're growing all over, especially at universities that teach forensics. Now there's also some at the Smithsonian too. So we should be able to just switch to using those sorts of things for teaching, and knowing that someone consented to having their remains used for these purposes. There was one question too. I'm sorry, what was the question that someone asked? I was going to say something about it.
Well, there were a couple. So speaking to Stacy Drake's question about the public charge law in her state, and there being that disconnect between legality and ethicality, she started out by asking you all to speak more to the notion of incarceration and the value and the benefit of really thinking about this history in the context of incarceration. And if that kind of lends to your position on whether or not these remains should stay in these museum and university laboratories.
I mean, some of the earliest allowed to be given over for scientific study, it was a post-mortem punishment. So after you were executed, your body was given over for doctors to dissect. And that created the stigma around dissecting bodies. And so if you, I'm so sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, so these bodies, originally it started as a punishment, and that kind of hung on for a while. And then we get to our history, the long history in this country, especially, of criminalizing being poor. So when there weren't enough criminals to give to doctors and students, then you started targeting the poor, and you'd say, so if you die and there's no one to claim your remains, or we're going to have to take care of your body, then those bodies can go be used for scientific study as well. And so that's very unethical. And there are still quite a few states that allow for the use of unclaimed bodies, but that's unfortunately a state level issue where you have to push your local legislatures to do these sorts of things.
Yes, and Delande, I'd love for you to hop in, knowing your theoretical orientation, and hear what you have to say about incarceration.
Well, I appreciate that question. And thinking of these remains as being part and parcel to a system of incarcerated bodies, I think it gets us to a space where we see a lot of these practices as remnants of these punitive measures, as Asia was mentioning. Even though that's a state law, and we're discussing ethicality versus legality, and the peoples who are being given to universities and hospitals aren't necessarily at fault or being criminalized per se. That is a direct result of those same practices of someone who was being punished, their remains being punished. They would then be given to an institution, or those in pauper cemeteries, the poor, because they cannot be within the same social class or social mobilities as others, to be claimed or to be in relation to others. That is their fault. That's their crime. That's what they're being punished for, essentially. So while it's not incarceration in the sense that you would think about it in terms of being criminalized or something, it is still these different genealogies of punitive measures. And it also speaks to different ways to begin these conversations. Maybe when we're thinking of repatriation and things of that nature, maybe we need to take a step back and think about what sort of underlying issues there are across not just museums, but their relationship to other institutions, protocols, and procedures. But in thinking of institutions, the question about how can institutions honor remains while still studying them, just to say expressly clearly, you can't decolonize a colonial institution. An institution can't honor the remains. Hopefully we have individuals or collectives within these institutions who can take on that labor of care and responsibility to commit to them. And I think that makes it especially important that we are thinking of this word study. We're being very intentional about how we're using it. To repatriate, you need to understand who these remains were. to do so, right? So that is a form of study, but how can we conduct these studies without being invasive or destructive? You know, a question I get all the time, I mean, especially with my research, it's like, well, can't you just match their DNA to all the Black people in DC? Which I won't even go down the tangent. That's just like the lack of, I don't have the bandwidth to even engage in it thoroughly, but you know, this idea of, you know, just do this DNA research when that calls for a destruction of the remains that we're attempting to protect, right? And also, you know, the pathetic post-colony project that is the US, you know, is nothing if not an entire necropolis of Black burials and Indigenous burials. So we're going to continue to need folks who can do these studies in conversation with their descendant communities, hopefully a representative of their these descendant communities, not to, you know, go on a representational politic vibe, but like, these are different forms of study that are to the benefit of that honor and that care, that aren't the same as the institutionality of what it means to study these remains.
Right, and those are such good points, because we also know, and not just with the New York African Burial Ground, but what's going on in Philadelphia now. I mean, a lot of change happens around communities demonstrating and community action. Direct action on the part of communities really helps to shift things. And so I'd also like you to speak to what you think a community-led approach to research and repatriation would look like. And Delande, I heard you say that your community-led approach is not just about scientists or researchers working with communities, but making sure that folks who are a part of the community are researchers as well. But can you all speak to that as broadly as you want?
Sure. You know, what could it look like? You know, fortunately, we don't have to extend our imaginations too far because there are already people doing this kind of amazing work. You know, I'm thinking of researchers in Florida, you know, Antoinette Jackson, Cheryl Rodriguez, who are approaching these issues of remains and burials and erasure through their own modalities of research, which are going to you know, amplify and inform other scholars who do research around preservation. And you know, these different you know, modalities of conducting research for these remains and for these burials, that only benefits, you know, these conversations that happen down the road you know, right now in Florida, I think in Tampa community, there's some legislation underway of like making it a county level, but hopefully state level, of what protection of remains might look like. There are folks in Montgomery County in Maryland who, I don't even think they're attached to institutions, but they're doing this sort of community-led work around, you know, preservation, that are then informing, you know, state guidelines and protocols. And that's not to say that legislation is always the answer, but we have some really brilliant examples of what community-oriented and community-led work already look like. And so I really believe that there's something to be said about, as opposed to looking for examples, creating what we can from when and where we enter.
Asia?
I just have people to suggest to look at for this. So two of my friends, one of the only good things that came out of COVID and lockdown is this ability to connect with people who you otherwise would not have met. And so this past year, I have met a couple of amazing Black women in historical archaeology. So first there's Tiffany is now Tiffany Fryer. She just was married. Her research and work, one of her most recent articles, she has Engendering Heritage, Contemporary Feminist Approaches to Archaeological Heritage. And she talks about positionality in archaeology. I will put her website in the chat. So she does amazing work working with the people who are related to the sites she has worked on. And then also Sharday Reed, who's at William and Mary right now. And she actually, I just had the privilege of watching her dissertation defense this week. And her ideas for community involvement are just, so she's not even generating her research questions per se. she's having what she's considering the descendant community of Black folks at the Newport Historical Society. They have a say in everything because she does not want to come at them as a scholar. She's helping them. So there are some, there's questions about sites and those sorts of things. And so she meets with groups of people and it's like, this is what we can do as an archaeologist. What questions do you have? And so both of their research, Tiffany Fryer and Sharday Reed, I think they're just excellent examples of where historical archaeology is going that that biological anthropology could definitely benefit from looking at.
Yes, Sharday, if you're on here and I misspelled your last name, I'm sorry. I know I spelled your first name correctly. And Sharday Reed is at, or just finished up at the College of William and Mary.
Oh, no, she just defended her proposal.
Oh, she just defended her proposal.
Yeah, she's
okay.
ABD.
She is ABD. Yay, congrats, Sharday. So thank you for mentioning those names and making sure that they get in the chat so everybody can look them up.
Right, and I'm putting the names that I mentioned as well.
Yes.
Can I add something quickly to what Asia mentioned? Thinking of folks who we've met and who are doing great work now, I don't really see myself as that much of an optimistic person per se. What's been warming and encouraging are to see folks who are still who are still developing their research protocol, beginning to take on these same initiatives. They're entering into their research and into their interests with the sort of like context and conversations that we're having now, which a few years ago that wasn't happening. I'm thinking about how long it took me to begin to incorporate these sorts of theories and conversations in my work. Recently, there was a forensic science conference where the president or director said that anti-racism has no space in forensic research. And one of my friends and colleagues, Isis Dwyer, immediately on the Slack channel, on Twitter, just immediately calling this out, calling out its history, calling out these contexts in which she's incorrect. And I'm just thinking about, wow, that speed with which we can resist and approach these statements. I'm thinking of my colleague Alexandra McDougall, who was working with these communities in Maryland, and thinking of like Maryland's Black histories, thinking of Black feminist genealogies through distant familial legacies, and how that can inform a different sort of approach to bioarchaeological and bioanthropological practice. And like sometimes I find that to be some of the most encouraging moments in this research, if you can have encouraging moments in this work,
Yes, and so Deborah's shouting out Penn grads, we're shouting out William and Mary folk, we have to shout out American University folk, in addition to Delande. Alex McDougall is a fantastic anthro from AU as well. I think we have covered all of the questions.
That I sent in advance.
Yes,
Yeah.
and ones that I saw. So I guess if there's time, it can be opened up or.
Yeah, I think we're a little wary about the opening.
Oh, right.
Because of what's been happening. We've been continuously kicking people out.
Yes.
But if anybody else has questions that they want to put in the chat now, we can be sure to have a moment to address them. If you are thinking about that, while you are thinking about that, I just want to say also thank you to the three of you, and especially Asia and Delande, for coming and talking about your research and sort of giving us a sense of what a younger generation is doing and thinking, and how they are transforming I'm trying to read and talk at the same time.
Right?
Transforming the field, right? Because, for me and for many of us, the 21st century anthropology really has to be informed by critical Indigenous and critical Black studies. And there has to be an engagement with these literatures and not just a nod to diversity. And so I think it's really important that you're talking about Black feminist scholarship and critical race theory. And Delande, I hear your nods to the pessimists in your references to study, but it's so important to sort of think through these other theoretical frames and take them and use them to transform our discipline. I think there was a question about NAGPRA. Gabrielle Powell has asked, yeah, if we're in a position to seek something like NAGPRA for people of the African diaspora in the US, and I know people are working on that. Does anybody want to address that here?
Delande, do you want to shout out your publication with
Oh God, no.
Justin?
Justin, yeah.
I've been very fortunate to be working with two incredible scholars and thinkers, Chip Caldwell and Justin Dunavant, who I've been learning so much from. We're currently working on an article. It's currently under review, where we're calling for how we might begin to consider an AGPRA, if you will, like an African American Barriers and Appreciation Act version, so that's sort of like, a corollary to NAGPRA. But these are also discussions that we're having, and never did I even think I would be in these spaces with leaders of professional organizations, activists, folks within the Smithsonian Institution, to see how these recommendations don't just sit within an article, but how we might be able to bring them to the political stage. Where right now there's legislation under discussion about how to protect African American burials, and what we're aiming for. But one of the things that we're aiming for is how can we expand that to be more inclusive and call for audits and protocols of institutional collections, because the issues that we're facing with institutional collections and the issue of the erasure of Black burial grounds, they have twin origins in these anti-Black practices. So to call for the protection of one necessitates the protection of the other. So these are things that are underway right now, and I'm cautiously optimistic that it will continue to build and hopefully get to somewhere where it does make its way to legislature. Though again, I continue to want to reinforce that legislation is not the entirety of the answer, but a powerful one.
Well, and also, Asia, I don't want to cut you off, but I did want to make the point because, this is a process. Rigor is, of course, a process, and ideas get planted and grow. I think it's important to mention that this is an idea that Justin cultivated as a master's student. He wrote a thesis about, contemplating this. And so now there are a critical mass of people working toward this. So I think it's really important to kind of talk about the trajectory of these ideas as well. Asia, sorry.
Oh no, what Delande said was great. I mean, the only thing I would add too is, Delande, you mentioned legislation isn't the only answer. I mean, there are still so many holes in NAGPRA. I mean, institutions are still full of Indigenous remains because there's too many loopholes, oh, you're not a federally recognized tribe, or they'll say something's too old to figure out which descendant community should receive the remains. And then you just get to keep that. I mean, even during my undergrad, we had collection that now I'm like, wait, why did we have it? And it's like, oh, because it was from 800 AD and we don't know where to give it to, who to give it to. So that's still an ongoing struggle that in our Indigenous community members are still fighting for, to get their ancestors returned to them.
Absolutely. Can I quickly add? Thank you. I'm sorry you got that up. At the very beginning, I mentioned thinking anti-colonially and relationally. The ways that folks who are engaged in NAGPRA policies and who are aware of the timing in which it came to be and the sort of lapses that we can now reflect on, the way that they have done this work of thinking through those lapses to help inform how an African American policy might be more inclusive and holistic, I think is a prime example of what it means to to collaborate, to acknowledge these multi-marginalized spaces and how we can do better working together. That sounds so idyllic, I'm sorry, but I really appreciate how it's been a very powerful moment in these conversations. It's there are so many gaps, there are so many lapses, there are so many shortfalls. How can our identification of them help you do better for your needs. That's been a really beautiful thing to witness.
Yeah, and before we move on to that question that was just posted, I want to say too that to remind people that last summer into the fall, there were a series of webinars that Venegren sponsored that were co-organized by the Society of Black Archaeologists and the Indigenous Archaeology Collective, thinking relationally about exactly these kinds of issues. And I think that's, more of that kind of collaborative work has to happen. And on sort of the topic you're discussing now, I just also wanted to alert people that there will be another Venegren webinar on May 20th that will continue these discussions, part of a series called Toward a Radically Humanist Anthropology that is being co-organized by me, Kamari Clark, the Association of Black Anthropologists, and Anthropology Southern Africa, hosted by Venegren, and we will continue these kinds of discussions specifically at the next one, which is May 20th. And a flyer will go out on the CEE listserv if you're interested, or you could just email me.
Okay, and a question from Christina. I was wondering if you could speak about the issue of privacy in forensic collections. It seems that a medical model of privacy is often used to protect individual identities, but at the same time, this privacy model also obscures the origins of collections and the personhood of individuals. I'm curious to hear what you think the role of privacy should be within forensic collections.
So that's a really good question. I think about, so I'll start first with like the identified collections we have. So for most of these, you have people's names, and that sort of information isn't like given to researchers or easily available. For example, in my research, I can't use full names of the women I'm studying. However, I think that if we were to want to repatriate remains from the older identified collections, knowing their names makes it so much easier. We could look for descendants. It's very doable. It would take a long time, but I'm certain we could find something to do. I also think a really good example comes from working with, like, if someone was affiliated with a certain church or something and looking for those descendant churches who take in the remains oftentimes. When it comes to forensic collections, I haven't worked with like recent, with known people. I've only worked in historical context. And so that's also a question. So like physical anthropology, for the most part, working with skeletons, we never have had to do, IRB, or usually exempt from it. And so there are, questions of should we have something like that? But I think the simplest thing to do would be, if we're switching to using donated bodies, just ask the person while they're alive, or ask their family, when we're taking these, like, how much information are you okay with people having access to? Should it be like after a set amount of time you could give out names, or like, these sorts of things? I mean, if we're doing things correctly, there should be someone to ask about that. And I would think that probably the newer collections that, like, Tennessee and Texas are putting together, I'm assuming they probably ask, whoever's donating the body, those sorts of things. It's more difficult with historic ones.
Phoebe Stubblefield,
Phoebe.
Florida, one of the few Black women forensic anthropologists, putting together a donated collection too.
Yeah.
So for me, there's this meaning between privacy and transparency. And actually, Rachel, I actually think you have your article about repositioning the Cobb Archive has a lot of great elements for which we can see like what sort of work and the necessity of maintaining very careful and intentional, archival data on these remains, because something else that we're trying to push for right now are these audits and a publicly available inventory. That, of course, for privacy's sake, will not list names and that sort of private information. But if there needs to be a repatriation, if there needs to be a contact with family members, it's the maintenance of those sorts of records from which we can then pull and get that sort of work done so much more quickly than having to, do the work all over again because they weren't managed in a careful way. So I really think that there's something to be said for on the institutions end, on the scholars end, the management protocols and procedures that go behind these collections.
Absolutely. And my citational politics are such that, yes, mine and Jennifer Muller's, we co-authored. Yes. I think, somebody mentioned, this reminds me of sealed adoption records and also sealed information about who organ donors are.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think we have covered all of the questions and comments that are in there up to this point. I want to thank everybody. I see Ken Nystrom and some other folk who are listing citations, suggested readings for folks. So thank you for that, as well as us. So please keep sharing that too.
Like last week, we will also compile some of these resources that are the resources that people are posting in the chat and send them out to folk. And I want to really thank you all for being available to have this conversation, to come together with us and think through the issues that we're facing here, knowing that our issues are common issues as well. Thank you for doing this quickly also. And as I said, if you want to continue these discussions in another week, you can. I see that Grace posted the poster to the Venegran webinar. And also, if people are in Philadelphia, tomorrow is the commemorative event of the MOVE bombing, May 13th. And we will be gathering at the corner of 63rd and Osage, where the MOVE marker is in West Philadelphia. There will be some memory work happening, some oral history, and just a chance to be together and support the family. So if you're interested in coming, definitely show up. And again, thank you all for being here. And thank you also for weathering the resistance to your brilliance. I so appreciate everybody hanging in there and sending love. Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.